Hi everyone, my name is Premjish Achari, and I'm a curator, writer, and filmmaker who is based out of New Delhi, India. Happy to be a part of this conference on tricontinental solidarity. Especially, I feel and I know that it's very important in the present political circumstances that we need more and active ways of forming solidarity among the three continents. I stand in solidarity with my friends and comrades of Venezuela, and we have seen the naked brutality of United States of America, how they have invaded a sovereign nation and taken away the leader of the nation, and Maduro, and it's so violent, it's so brutal. And also what we are seeing throughout United States of America, the kind of violence ICE is doing to the immigrants. And I feel that's where this image, which I'm sharing with you, that's the first Solidarity Conference that is happening here. And we are celebrating right now the 60th anniversary of that in the city of Havana. So thank you, comrades, for organizing this. Thank you, friends, and thank you all for all the academics and PAR and others who are organizing this amazing conference. I'm going to speak about decolonial cultural sovereignty and agonistic solidarity in this particular presentation, which is looking at my own exhibition practice. We'll touch upon exhibition curation, but also in a very political manner and be referring to a lot of political theory and um, cultural studies and examples from different aspects of that. So across the globe right now, from biennials to Lagos to museums in Sao Paulo, from Delhi to Abu Dhabi, sorry, decolonial thought has been institutionalized, and we know that it has become like an important term. It has been used across in pedagogy, in exhibition practices, in publishing literature, in paper presentations and conferences. And I feel that it's very important to make some distinctions and also to clear our positions where we stand in terms of decolonization. Because even the right wing government in India blames or uses decolonization to blame colonial rule and also to attack progressive thinking as Western important as a result of colonialism. It also blames people with different sexualities, marginalized communities, and also um, people who protest, the dissidents, activists, and all as imports of this kind of training. So that's where I feel that it's very important to have a discussion on that. And it has also become mandatory. So curators speak earnestly about representation, about giving voice to the marginalized, about diversity and inclusion. And on the surface, this seems progressive, even necessary. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Institutional adoption of decolonial language often neutralizes decolonial critique. The very language of inclusion, diversity, and consensus that sounds liberatory often functions as a mechanism of containment. So when an institution successfully diversifies its exhibitions, it appears progressive. The appearance of transformation substitutes for actual structural change. So this is what I want to explore today, the distinction between inclusion and sovereignty. Because decolonial cultural sovereignty, the right to epistemic self-determination, to define knowledge on your own terms, is fundamentally incompatible with consensus-seeking inclusion. And this incompatibility, I want to argue, is productive. It's actually where decolonial curatorial practice must operate in the space of antagonism and dissensus. So I'll be drawing reference, as I said earlier, from my exhibitions and theoretical writing to provide concrete, compelling evidence for this argument. But first, let me establish the theoretical scaffolding of this. So let's start with a concept that might sound abstract, but which becomes tangible once we enter a gallery, the coloniality of power. Chantal Mouffe, the very famous political theorist, critiques the liberal democratic ideal of rational consensus achieved through deliberation. She argues this denies something fundamental about political life, the ever present potential for conflict. So she distinguishes between the political, quote unquote, the political, the dimension of antagonism and irreducible difference, and politics. That is, again, quote unquote, politics, which are the formal practices that manage conflict and reproduce social order. In an agonistic model, opponents are not enemies to be destroyed or assimilated, but adversaries whose existence is legitimate even though their competing visions cannot be reconciled. Democracy presupposes incompleteness, not final consensus. And applied to curatorial practice and also to collaborative practices, collective practices where artists, cultural workers, and all come together, it's very important to look that this means that museum or gallery and all these institutions are not a neutral procedural space. Even the way we collaborate is not a neutral space, but it is a battleground where competing hegemonic projects confront one another. The curator's job is not to facilitate inclusion or kind of dilute or kind of be a mediator of the situation, but to actively produce dissensus, to demonstrate gaps in what Rancière calls the distribution of the sensible, the implicit ordering of what can be seen, said, and thought. So we have these two frames converging: decolonial sovereignty demanding epistemic disobedience, agonistic pluralism demands institutionalization of conflict. They are not separate, they are mutually reinforcing. When you demand sovereignty, you are necessarily introducing antagonism into institutions built on consensus. And this is what I also hope, I aspire that I'm not there, and I'm really sorry that I could not come. But I really hope, I really wish that all of us here gathered here in the name of Tricontinental Solidarity, celebrating the 60th anniversary of Tricontinental Solidarity, are not in this hope that we all will be gathering together and celebrating. We are one. We are the three nations suffering from the Western colonialism, the white European colonialism, Anglo-European colonialism, and all. No, we need to also sit together and discuss, fight, debate with each other. That's very important for us to do right now. So what I want to argue is that most contemporary curatorial practice fails on both counts. It claims to be decolonial while operating entirely within inherited Western aesthetic and political frameworks. It claims to embrace plurality while actually seeking consensus. And there are two critical gaps I want to map. Anibal Quijano, a Peruvian sociologist, developed this idea to explain that colonialism did not end when political independence was achieved. And we all know that in various post colonial contexts. Instead, colonial hierarchies persist through what he calls the coloniality of power. Structural, racial, and cultural inequalities embedded in how we know, value, and organize the world. And similarly, Walter Mignolo expanded this by proposing the colonial matrix of power, which operates across four interconnected domains: the control of economy, of authority, of sexuality and gender, and critically for us as curators, the control of knowledge and subjectivity. So, cultural institutions have historically been crucial tools within this matrix, and they have normalized Eurocentric narratives. They have reinforced racial classifications as determined whose knowledge counts as legitimate. So, when we talk about decolonial cultural sovereignty, we are talking about the demand for what Mignolo calls epistemic disobedience, the right to de-link from Western modernity and validate pluriversal knowledge systems. It's about having the authority to say our way of knowing, of sensing, of being in the world is legitimate, not because Western institutions endorse it, but because it emerges from our own struggles, our own histories, our own aesthetic and philosophical traditions. Now, here's where curation becomes essential because if sovereignty means the right to define knowledge outside Western categories, then exercising that right inside a Western institution or one model after it inherently creates conflict. The curator becomes a site of this conflict, and this is not a bug, it's a feature. So let me take you through gap one by asking a seemingly simple question: what counts as art? More specifically, what sensory experience do we recognize as valid? What forms of expression do we perceive as beautiful, meaningful, worthy of institutional attention? The answer, Mignolo argues, traces back to 17th century Immanuel Kant. Before Kant, aesthesis simply meant raw sensation, an unelaborated awareness of stimulation. But Kant theorized aesthetics with a capital A. He established European standards of the beautiful and sublime and projected them universally as if they were natural, not constructed. So, this colonization of aesthesis is very important for us to understand because museums and galleries function as the modern gatekeepers of these Kantian standards. They exercise the power to decide not just which histories are told, but how they are told, which sensory registers are valued, which aesthetic forms are recognized as legitimate, which epistemologies count as knowledge. And when curators operate within this inherited Kantian structure, they subject non Western artistic production to colonized sensory regulations. The work must be legible within inherited frameworks. It must conform to expectations about how art communicates, what materials are appropriate, what temporal registers are acceptable. In other words, it must be translated and validated by the colonial system to be accepted. And once it is accepted, it loses its sovereign claim. It's been assimilated. So, in my book, The Lure of Collaboration, Dissecting Consensus, where I have done an extensive critique of the practice of collaboration, especially looking at the recent surge in collaborative practices. So, I'm providing a precise diagnosis of how this aesthetic assimilation operates internally within collaborative groups and also within the Indian art world. So I argue that consensus in the contemporary art community is built within what I call a financial, professional, main-centric, and casteist fraternity, caste-based fraternity. So my central argument is that Indian art is not a community; it's a fraternity, and this matters because it illustrates something crucial. The demand for consensus functions as a mechanism to preserve specific historically entrenched power structures. So, when we celebrate collaboration and consensus, we are often celebrating the smooth exclusion of anyone who does not fit the profile of that fraternity. So, I make a crucial distinction here between social inclusion and social justice. Inclusion might mean adding diverse faces to the board or the exhibition checklist. So in India or in Hindi, we use the word tadka. Tadka is the last seasoning you do after the meat, the dish is prepared in curries and all. So there was a friend curator who has made a funny critique about this is that let's put some Dalit tadka, let's put some gender tadka, let's put some minority tadka. So curators operate with this tadka seasoning to kind of tick all the checklist. But social justice means any conscious attempt from outside or within the community to end the oppression of particular groups and create equal access and rights to resources. And these are not the same. And this distinction is everything. Because you can include Dalit artists, women artists, Adivasi artists without transforming the fundamental criteria through which art is valued. You can include them and still require that their work conform to Kantian sensory standards. You can include them and still require external Western validation for their knowledge to count as legitimate. That is epistemic appropriation disguised as representation. So this is an exhibition I want to talk. This happened in November 2024 in Abu Dhabi. It's called Imperial Silhouettes, Shadows of Sovereignty, with artists from different parts of the world. So this exhibition that it was shown in Risk Art Gallery in Abu Dhabi, and it featured artists like Kara Walker, Sudarshan Shetty, Sayan Derek from Philippines, Sujay Shah from Kenya, Wambui Kamiru, Yo Wosu from Ghana, and others from Pakistan and different parts, especially from again from the three continents also, and all engaging with the imperialism's legacies in different ways, in different expressions, with different concerns and all mostly from formerly colonized nations. But here's what is important. I did not organize the exhibition to create synthesis or unified aesthetic experience. There's no overarching curatorial narrative that smooths over our differences. Instead, Kerouac's black cut paper silhouettes addressing American racism exist in productive tension with Derrid's cartographic investigations of colonialism across continents, which differ fundamentally from Shaw's interrogation of ideologies within Africa. The curatorial methodology actively resists what Rancière calls the distribution of the sensible. It refuses to allow any single aesthetic framework from achieving dominance. Works that have different formal registers, different conceptual commitments, different ways of addressing imperialism are held in deliberate tension. And this creates what I called uncomfortable plurality. The exhibition does not invite comfortable aesthetic contemplation. It forces negotiation. And this is epistemic disobedience through curatorial form. What I'm saying is that these artists' way of sensing, knowing, and representing the world don't need to be translated into a unified Western aesthetic framework to be valid. Their difference is not a problem to be solved through a curatorial synthesis. It is the point. So now I want to shift to Gap 2, which is about solidarity itself. So the Tricontinental Conference in Havana in 1966 was historically crucial, and it united the liberation struggles from Africa, Asia, and Latin America against imperialism and colonialism. OSPAL, the Organization of Solidarity with the Peoples of Africa, Asia, and Latin America, emerged as a powerful platform for internationalist visual culture and political organizing. This was real solidarity, forged through shared struggle against a common enemy. But here is the problem. Contemporary curatorial invocations of tricontinental solidarity or South South exchange often romanticize this history. They present it as seamless unity. They suppress the internal ideological fractures, the disagreements, the necessary conflicts that existed even among allies. Why does this matter? Because if you are not careful, you replace one global hierarchy, Eurocentrism, with a new regional one. You establish new forms of authority by representing the global south as monolithic, and you lose the agonistic dimension that was actually generative in the historical moment. So the historical tricontinental achieved unity partly through suppressing internal dissent. That was necessary given the external threat. But in the contemporary period, without that unified enemy, monolithic presentation becomes authoritative. It prevents the necessary internal debates about what sovereignty means across different African, Asian, and Latin American epistemologies and political projects. So next, I want to talk about this three-part exhibition, which which I call as the Chaos Trilogy. The first one was called Disorder Under Heaven. The second one was called Aliens in a Foreign Land, and the third one was called Out of Here, That's My Call. This was organized in Bombay, and I locate these exhibitions explicitly in what I call the chaos, change, desire, and crisis that exploded after the 1990s in post colonial India, post liberalization, post liberal politics. This is not a unified moment, it is precisely a moment of fracture, contradictions, competing visions of what development and self determination should be. Rather than treating this period chronologically, as we could neatly narrate the progression from liberalization through its consequences, I map it aesthetically and non linearly. I examine iconic moments while drawing connections with the present, deliberately refusing to contain the past in historical periodization. In Disorder Under Heaven, artists like Atul Dodia, K.P. Reggie, Pooja Ranna, and Mithu Sen address communal violence, environmental destruction, the consolidation of Hindu nationalism. Their works don't synthesize into a unified critique. They maintain different formal registers, different political commitments, different ways of engaging with chaos. Some focus on violence at the level of the body, others at the scale of infrastructure, others through conceptual abstraction. The exhibition holds all of this intention. In Aliens in a Foreign Land, the focus shifts to displacement, to exclusion from citizenship. And India, as we know, in the last after before few years, we had a series of protests, continuous protests, where large numbers of people came out against the new Citizenship Act called the CA NRC, where the current government wanted deliberately to remove the minorities and also bring back the Hindu communities from outside India, but by removing the minorities who belonged to India for centuries, who stayed for for India, not for centuries, but for many, many, like long period. But basically to displace them from their homeland and call them as Pakistanis or aliens. And in the final exhibition in Out of Here, That's My Goal, climate catastrophe and mass disenfranchisement became central. And it was also to foreground a South Asian vision about ecology and climate change, not operate via the typical Eurocentric United Nations kind of idea of ecology and climate crisis. So across all these three iterations, I deliberately avoided a synthetic narrative. I refused to resolve the contradictions or present triumphalist narratives of resistance. Instead, I staged the antagonisms themselves as the content of the exhibition. And this methodology operationalizes something crucial. It demonstrates that the colonial past does not exist safely in historical time. It persists, it reverberates, it mutates. And by refusing chronological containment, I activate what we might call agonistic temporality, a refusal to pacify history into the past, an insistence that ongoing structures of domination demand present day antagonism. So these are some of the images from the exhibition. On the left side is Vivan Sundaram's 1968 work based on the 1968 protest barricade. And here is a work by a young artist called Ranjita Kumari. So Viman coming from the Marxist tradition, and here Ranjita coming from the Ambedkarite tradition, looking at the Indian Constitution and the preamble and the hope of the preamble from an Ambedkarite Dalit perspective. And this is another exhibition called All Canaries Bear Watching. However, and I believe that this is the most explicit operationalization of agonistic solidarity as a project that was developed as part of the Grid Heritage Project, an Indo-UK research network in collaboration with Jawaharlal Nehru University, JNU, and SOAS, University of Sussex, and all. So the title, All Canaries Bear Watching, reference to Guinier and Torres's The Miner's Canary. The canary in coal mines serve as an early warning system because it said that the miners, when they enter into these coal mines, they set out a canary, and because canaries' lungs are so weak, it will immediately the lungs fail first when the toxic conditions. So it's a warning for the miners. So Whittier and Torres use this metaphor to describe how marginalized communities become beacons of distress, revealing what dominant society refuses to acknowledge. And I mobilized this metaphor in the exhibition, where I have framed marginalized subjects, particularly women, Dalit, and indigenous communities, not as objects to be represented or included, but as sources of necessary discomfort for the institution and its audience. And I refuse to homogenize marginalization. The exhibition includes Patachitra works, which is like the folk, what is considered as the folk art in India by Dukhusham Chitrakar and Lutfa Chitrakar, depicting both pandemic experiences and epic temporalities. Then there were documentary videos of Malti Rao, who is an Ambedkarite Dalit activist singing Ambedkarite songs, and sculptural assemblages that were made by the Tandil Fund of Archives, who use archival fragments and blouses in reference to Koli women, the fishing community, their histories and Portuguese colonial impositions. Works addressing caste, gender, ecology, displacement, all existing in deliberate tension. And this exhibition was a work in progress, deliberately incomplete, foregrounding incompleteness and ongoing contestation. This is not accidental, it's methodological. And the exhibition refuses to settle antagonisms into manageable narratives. It refuses to offer comfortable resolution. Instead, the canary becomes what I call as necessary antagonistic alarm bell. The marginalized figure ruptures the facade of social harmony. The exhibition forces audiences and institutions to confront the toxicity normalized through consensus formation. And this is agonistic solidarity operationalized. Solidarity defined not by unity, but by the right to adversarial disagreement among adversaries. Solidarity that acknowledges internal fractures as legitimate political conflicts, not problems to be solved through consensus. These are some more images from the exhibition. Also, that's on the right side, what you see, Pattachitra by the Kushab Chitrakar and Lutfa Chitrakar. And those photo frames in the black and white are photographs by Sudhakar Olve of the Dalit community who are into manual scavenging, the cleaning basically shit and removing them from the sewers. And many of them who die in the process or live not live very long. And on the far left is the blouses that were part of the Koli women's history and the taxes Portuguese government imposed on them for wearing blouses. So we have identified two gaps: the persistence of Kantian aesthetic gatekeeping and the romanticization of monolithic tricontinental unity. We have seen how exhibitions expose and engage these gaps. But what are the specific methodologies we need to develop? What does it mean to actually operationalize dissensus? And I want to outline four key methodologies that my exhibitions have demonstrated because I think these become templates for other curators to think about how to practice agonistically. Methodology one, epistemic disobedience and reclamation. And the first, this is inspired by Walter Mignolo. And this means actively foregrounding marginalized knowledge systems as valid on their own terms without requiring external validation. So Imperial Silhouettes does this by refusing to subordinate diverse artistic epistemologies to a unified curatorial framework. But it goes further. The exhibition's very form becomes disobedient. By resisting synthesis, by maintaining tension between incommensurable ways of knowing and representing, the exhibition becomes unintelligible to the Western aesthetic apparatus. It refuses to make itself legible within inherited frameworks. That unintelligibility is not failure, it is the point. Methodology 2, agonistic dissection of consensus. The second is what we might call agonistic dissection, actively staging internal conflict over whose knowledge counts, whose labor is valued, how power distributes within supposedly marginalized communities. So, the lure of collaboration, the book I was talking about, explicitly performs this dissection at the level of scholarship and criticism. And I argue that by pursuing superficial consensus, the art world naturalizes caste hierarchies, gender violence, and class exclusion. So, real community formation requires embracing antagonisms, not suppressing it. And curatorially, this means deliberately highlighting internal tensions. It means refusing to present marginalized communities as unified. It means acknowledging, for instance, that processes of restitution and repatriation involve genuine disagreement even among originating communities about what return should mean. An agonistic curator hosts this dissensus rather than seeking singular resolution. Methodology 3, non-linear temporality and agonistic memory. So this involves restructuring how exhibitions relate to time and memory. So the Chaos Trilogy exhibition, which I talked about, demonstrates this through its deliberate refusal of chronology. But treating chaos as a continuous phenomenon rather than historical moment, the curatorial framework demonstrates that structural inequalities persist through mutation and iteration. Colonial violence does not exist safely in the past. It recurs, it reconfigures itself, it demands present day antagonism. Non-linear temporality becomes a form of truth telling about power's ongoing operation. And finally, methodology 4, curating dissensus, the canary as disruption. And this is inspired by the exhibition All Canaries Bear Watching. The canary functions not as a symbol of victimhood, but as a source of necessary institutional discomfort. The marginalized figure becomes what Rancière calls a rupture in the distribution of the sensible, the implicit ordering of what can be seen and thought. The exhibition does not offer interpretation. It forces audiences into positions where they must negotiate competing frameworks, conflicting temporalities, incommensurable claims. And this discomfort is productive. It prevents retreat into comfortable critical distance. It demands engagement with antagonism rather than contemplation of representation. Thank you.